Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the next plenary talk with Lori Gruen. I am honored to introduce her. Lori Gruen is the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University, where she coordinates Wesleyan Animal Studies. She is also the Professor of Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Science and Society. She's the author and editor of 9 books, including Ethics in Animals, an Introduction, The Ethics of Captivity, and Entangled Empathy, all of which I teach in my classes, and the students love them, and the latter of which is published by Lantern Press and so available out there if anybody is interested. She also has a million other affiliations that it would take forever to detail here, but I do want to mention one, which is an evolving website that documents the journey to sanctuary of the remaining chimpanzees in research labs, The Last 1,000. I also want to mention that Lori is an incredible friend and mentor to many people in animal rights and animal studies, including me, and I know other people in this room and at this conference. It was amazing to hear her talk last night about how Tom Regan showed her that you can be an academic and an activist at the same time, and to do both really well. I had never heard that before, but I know that for many years, many people have said exactly the same thing about Lori.
That's sweet.
Her influence is necessary and fortunately also impossible to overstate. So with that, please welcome Lori Gruen.
Let me hug you. And thank you all. And really, thanks again. I know we've all been thanking the organizers, but this is such a hard thing to put together, and it's so nice that we're all here. I wish it was a little warmer, but I know the organizers can't really do much about that. So I've been thinking a lot about captivity, and I've been worried about the resources that traditional ethical theory and political theory provide in trying to say what's wrong with captivity. And it seems that something's missing. And so in the vein that I think we got yesterday, that Will Kimlicka's paper, there needs to be a new set of categories that we need to evaluate, or that would be useful to evaluate, in order to be able to more fully articulate what these harms and what these wrongs are. And so one of the things that I've been thinking is that disposability is a concept that isn't thought about as much, really much at all. And I think this is, one of the things that's really important. If you think about captivity, even if it's not permanent, we tend to think, or there's at least a sense in which you can think about sort of locking you up and throwing away the key. So it's both the key that's disposed of, but importantly, you're also, in some sense, if you're the one who's locked up, disposed of. And of course, being held captive causes all sorts of frustration, and that harm can be articulated with traditional theories. And these are both physical harms when it comes to certain kinds of enclosures for other animals, but it's also psychological harms and so deeply socially devastating harms as well. And humans and non-humans who are incarcerated, that's what I think of as incarceration, is confined by bars, chains, cages, prisons, coops, and locked doors for which the key has been thrown away, are really denied the most basic freedoms. And we can talk about the denial of these freedoms for humans with traditional ethical, political, and philosophical tools. For example, they're not free to make basic choices. And you might say, well, none of us are really free to make all these basic choices. We can't make any kind of choice about what we want to do. We're restricted in all sorts of ways by the genders we're assigned, by our physical and our mental and cognitive and emotional abilities, by our class, by religion, by ethnicity, by nationality, and even by our species. We're also restricted by state power, biopower, and other governmental and economic forces that prescribe all sorts of choices and force other choices upon us. But being limited in our choices, which we always are, because I have argued that, and I believe freedom of choice particularly is somewhat illusory rhetoric, But that differs fundamentally from physical confinement. And I also want to highlight that not all physical confinement counts as captivity. Being physically confined, say, to Mexico City, or something even vaster, the whole planet Earth, or to a really small space like a baby stroller, it doesn't mean that you're a captive, because humans and other animals are physically limited to what our bodies can do. That doesn't mean that we are, in the sense that I want to think about it, captive. It definitely minimizes certain kinds of opportunities, but to say that someone who is in a wheelchair is in some way identical to someone who is incarcerated in a prison sort of deflects the distinct challenges that are posed by that kind of incarceration. I just want to also highlight that autonomy is another tool that we have at our disposal in thinking about what might be wrong with captivity. And certainly, those who are held captive are denied their autonomy in a variety of ways. But I want to highlight one particular feature that I think isn't thought about enough, and that's that those who are captive, in the sense that I'm interested in, are practically and existentially dependent on their captors. So they're not only dependent, which we all often are in many ways, and I think Sonora Taylor has done a brilliant job in her new book, Beasts of Burden, to show why our fetishization of independence is a problem. But in this case, dependency in the cases that I want to look at is institutionalized, and that's what I'm really wanting us to think about. It renders those who are incarcerated, is the word I like to use, as subjugated beings. So it's marked by domination, whether it's actual domination or just a threat of domination. And there's something even worse. Sorry, this is kind of wrong with captivity. It's something I talk a little bit about in my book that Jeff just mentions. It's an edited volume on the ethics of captivity. And in that chapter, in a chapter that I wrote, I argue that one of the things that happens that's wrong with captivity is that captivity is fundamentally dignity denying. So when Will was talking yesterday, for some of you who weren't here, what Will was suggesting is that there is a new reinvigoration of the claim, he calls them dignitarians, that the human rights projects, various human rights projects, are looking towards dignity and the reinscription of dignity and the reclaiming of dignity to show that it's fundamentally about what humans do, fundamentally a feature of humans, that we have dignity, and in order to have dignity, we have to deny non-humans their dignity. That's the fundamental, or any dignity, that it's fundamental and inherent in humans that we have dignity, and it's on the basis of that dignity that we have human rights, and that dignity is unique to human beings. And so what he's argued is that this human species hierarchy, or this human exceptionalism, is what needs to be maintained in order to recognize and preserve the value of dignity. And so what I want to talk about is how this human species hierarchy isn't, and has really never been, for all humans, and how it's not only non-humans, but also humans who are considered others and denied dignity through the notion of disposability. So that's really kind of by way of preamble, long preamble. And I also want to flag that there is a notion in that comes out of Saidiya Hartman's remarkable and painful work recounting the experiences of women who were enslaved in the United States during periods of slavery, where human beings were considered fungible. So this idea of disposable, fungible is really the idea I want to explore with you today. So I think, just to sort of make it continuous for those of you who were here yesterday, so one of the neat things that Will was doing yesterday was highlighting questions about vulnerability as being a useful new tool for thinking through some of these issues. And it's questions about precarity, which is something that has become really important. And I want to just urge that this question of disposability is another really important tool that is not adequately theorized. And so I'm just hoping to provide some insight, not the definitive theory, but some insight into that today. Okay. Here's Marius. Remember Marius? Marius is a really sad story. A 2-year-old giraffe, you may know, who got shot in the head by the administrators of the Copenhagen Zoo. That was in February of 2014. Okay, here's a trigger warning. I'm going to show you a slide that's not pretty, but not, hopefully not too terrible, but if you're at all triggered, close your eyes. They shot him, and then they performed a public autopsy of his body, and they fed Marius's body parts to the lions at the zoo, with children watching. Shocking. This is, I guess, they thought of it as educational. It's not clear what they're being educated about. I'm always reminded when I think of claims about education, who's being educated, of a brilliant old paper that Dale Jamieson wrote about how zoos miseducate. This was a really interesting experience. The people, many people, not all people, but some people who are involved in the zoo world in Europe applaud this public killing and feeding. Others don't, so it's not something that is actually uniformly agreed upon in the zoo world. But I want to suggest that this is what's being taught here. Whatever you want to think is being taught, but what's being taught here is that animals are disposable. This is a great case of disposability. I just should also add, a bit more privately, these lions were killed at the same zoo after they ate Marius because they weren't of the genetically right type. And that is part of why this sort of zoo disposability is just central. And I just heard, did anybody hear this? There were some perfectly healthy baby, tigers, lions that were just killed in Denmark. Where was it? Denmark, Sweden. Yeah. So this is these are really, I think, important examples of disposability, of teaching disposability. So the justification for the lions killing was that they wanted to introduce a younger, more genetically quote-unquote fit animal. And so sacrificing these animals is just part of what is done in European zoos. Mark Beckhoff has called it zoothanasia instead of euthanasia. And it's basically done in a much less troubling way. I mean, not usually a shotgun to the head. It's usually a little bit less public and a little less painful. But it does seem that this is a clear act of disposability. Now, here's another thing I want to highlight about disposability. It's not commodification. If you might think about maybe these animals, what's wrong here is we're treating these animals as commodities. That's not what's happening. They're not, in a traditional sense, being traded on markets, although there is another area, obviously, as many of us know, of animals where they are used as commodities. That's a big one. But this isn't what's going on here. This is a case, I think, more clearly of a process of specimenification, what a terrible word, but it's turning these animals into in this instance, genetic specimens, and then being able to dispose of them when they don't rise up to a level that's thought to be interesting enough, scientifically important enough, beautiful enough, entertaining enough, whatever the need might be. And so this idea that animals, that we can use and dispose of animals as we see fit, is a really, I think, significant issue with zoos, but not only with zoos. I want to turn to a different form of disposability. It's not euthanasia per se. It's a zoo again, but again, this is partly what I think is, the disposability question becomes fairly poignant in the context of captivity. This is, of course, Harambe, and Harambe was killed in Cincinnati when a young boy entered his enclosure, caused a lot of interesting discussion, and a lot of problems as well. Here, the animal is disposable if there has to be a choice between, and the choice is a pointed choice, a choice between killing the gorilla, which is what they did, or allowing the boy who accidentally entered the enclosure to potentially, again, potentially, it wasn't clear that he would have been harmed, but the potential harm was enough to kill Harambe. Now, interestingly, there was a lot of discussion, I think, about the disposability in this case. This is one of my pieces. I wrote an op-ed about the problem wasn't that they killed Harambe. The problem is that they're a zoo. And part of what is going on in this case is that I think it's really useful for thinking of zoos as, again, just to reiterate, as sites of educating people about animals as disposable. That's part of what they're doing. And I think that the logic of disposability is really on display. It's not just that it's domination, although it's that too, but it's actually a kind of structure, this logic of disposability, that authorizes a certain kind of violence. And it authorizes a kind of violence that allows for the killing of non-human great apes, but I want to suggest it's also at work in the killing of human great apes. And now I know, let me just say, I'm well aware of the danger of just saying that, and I want to acknowledge the danger of saying that as well. The Black Lives Matter movement has reminded us that we have a long, long, long way to go in the United States to achieve anything resembling justice for humans. But there are also, importantly, Black scholars who are suggesting that there is actually no way of achieving justice given our current configuration of the world. And this again highlights some of the limitations and problems with our traditional approaches to addressing the kind of violence and exclusion that's so much a part of what we're seeing. So I think it's really important to understand that disposability is not just about the disposability of animals, but it's the disposability of all of those who fit into the category of other. Now, in the case of, again, Harambe, it did appear as if it was a zero-sum kind of situation, that you could either care about the disposability or the death or the killing of Harambe, or you should be caring about or should care more about the struggle for racial justice in the United States. So this is one of the interesting little pieces that was written after all of the outcry about Harambe, and what Sonali Kolhatkar suggests is that, quote, and this is, you can read it on your own, but I'll just read a little bit of it, that I'm all for humane treatment of animals, Still, not until I saw how insanely fixated the media and public seemed to be by this story did I even care why or how the gorilla was killed. Why are people so outraged? Why don't Black lives matter, or refugee lives matter, or the lives of low-paid workers, drone attack victims, imprisoned migrants, death row exonerees, and other humans matter as much as the gorilla in the zoo? So there's this disavowal that's operating. You either care about the killing of non-humans, or you care about the killing of humans, but somehow you can't care about both of these things. And what I'm trying to suggest is that if we are really worried about disposability, it provides us with an in for thinking about how both of these disregard and violence against others needs to be challenged. Of course, the same thing happened with our friend Cecil, right? Which is, again, another instance of the case where, again, it's not in a zoo, but the animal is sort of the kind of being that can be disposed of. Of course, the same outcry happened. Why are people concerned about this animal and not humans? Roxane Gay did this funny thing where she was supposed to say, she said, well, maybe people would care more about me as a Black woman if I dressed up in a lion's outfit. Of course, that lion was just killed, so I don't recommend that she go dress up in a lion. Well, especially if she's out somewhere where you can readily kill them. So the disposability I want to suggest is something that reinforces the value of those who are others, who are outside of the category of those, like what Will was suggesting yesterday, that have dignity. And I think that there's actually something a little bit more going on with this disposability. We like some things to be disposable. It helps us in our daily lives when we have things that are disposable. We're kind of attached. We're trying not to be as attached to disposable things, but it really is a great convenience to have things be disposable. I want to suggest that it actually is also a convenience in the case of this white human supremacy to have beings who are disposable. It helps us in our ways. And this is really the central point. And I think, no, that's not happening, hold on. And this is something that also comes out of the work of Claire Kim. And what she has, I think, importantly suggested, and again, this is a little bit different, I think that the taxonomy of power that is so central is to keep those who aren't, and again, this is in the context primarily of the US, but also we see it in Europe, that there is what she writes as this historically conjoined two logics of race and species taxonomies that continue to sustain and energize one another in the joint project of producing the human and the subhuman, not human or less than human, with all of the entailments of moral considerability or lack of moral considerability that brings, physical vulnerability, grievability, and now I'm suggesting disposability. If race is part of the metric of animality, a set of categories constituted through species distinction, then one cannot reproduce degraded meanings of animality and nature without inflaming notions of racial difference. So these things are fundamentally, she's suggesting, and I agree, conceptually linked. And disavowal is, as James Baldwin put it, a form of culpable ignorance. It describes, in his words again, what white people in the United States do to refuse recognition of Black people in the United States, not just recognition or equality as citizens, but as humans. And one of the things that I think Silko has been so powerful in, sorry, that wasn't supposed to come up yet. One of the things that Sil has been so powerful in arguing, following on Sylvia Wynter's work, why is this happening? Help. is that the case of what police did during the Sylvia Winters writes, and Silko reflects on this in Afroisms, that in the Rodney King beating in Los Angeles in the United States, the term "no humans involved" was coined as a way, NHI. And police regularly since that period have often, if there is an individual who's black who's killed, they will say that there's no humans involved in this crime. It's central, a part of the carceral system. And I think that in the United States in particular, in our era of mass incarceration, we have a problem of real disposability. And I think you see that in the way in which certain kinds of policies and practices and procedures are operating. And so part of what I wanted to do is sort of segue into the ways in which disposability is not good, not just for those of us who are not yet, how do you put it, not yet considered disposable? Hopefully that's not the right way to put it. Those of us who aren't usually thought to be disposable and those who are. And I just wanted to share a little bit about a course I just finished teaching. I've been teaching in a maximum security men's prison for about 10 years. And I just finished teaching an Introduction to Ethics course. And the Introduction to Ethics course involves teaching some Kant, teaching some utilitarianism, and then teaching some ethics of care. And one of the things that's just remarkable is that this is a group of men who have been really disposed of. In fact, in my class of 200 men, they're serving a combined sentence of 746 years. Take that in. That's disposability. 746 years. That's just 20 of the 1,300 people who are incarcerated in this one prison. There are 2.2 million people who are incarcerated in the United States. So think about that as disposability. Thinking about what's lost is not, yes, freedom. So this is the point, right? Yes, there's freedoms that are lost. Yes, there's choices that are lost. Yes, there's abilities to, there's frustrations, there's physical pain, there's a lack of privacy. There's all sorts of things that are harms that we have understanding and ways of talking about. But we're also talking about a certain kind of, I want to suggest maybe ontological loss of time, of value, and of dignity. And I think we see this in the case of all sorts of non-human animals, and we're seeing it in the case of human animals as well. So there's just this disregard for the lives and the bodies of black people who have been reduced, as I suggest, to what we might call bare life. And the idea, then, is that this category of the intrinsically valuable, we talked a little bit last night about Tom's notion that all lives matter, this intrinsic value that is thought to be attached to humans isn't yet attached to all humans. And if it's not yet attached to all humans, it's certainly not attached to other animals. And I think that part of what I'm interested in thinking through, and I really want to discuss with you all, is I think there's also something more. I think that our value, the value that we have, is dependent upon, it requires the existence of those that are disposable. Right? And this was really poignantly asked yesterday during Will's. Does the dignity of human beings require the exploitation of other animals? And I think that there's something fundamental to these conceptual structures that hasn't been theorized enough. Okay, I don't want to end on a bad note. So I've been trying to think about where and how we might have more possibilities for thinking about altering these kinds of disposable relationships. And I think that sanctuaries as sites of social justice may be a possible, and not the answer, but a possible way of thinking about how we might live otherwise. And Sue Donaldson and Will Kemlicka, again, have been doing some really interesting new work on, they've done a little bit of work that's already published and some new work that I hope is going to be published soon on new ways of living together with other animals, new economies, new ways of thinking of labor. Timothy Patcheretz has a new chapter on sanctuary in a book I've edited that'll be coming out in the fall called Critical Terms for Animal Studies, and he's thinking of sanctuary as a site of resistance. And I think there's a lot of potential in thinking about how we might form new relationships within the context of sanctuary. Part of the reason I think so is that there's this focus on the particularity of these individuals within their social networks. And this is true in sanctuaries for formerly farmed animals. It's true for sanctuaries with chimpanzees, sanctuaries that I've been working with, where what you see is an appreciation and a value of these individuals who were in the category of disposable. They were disposable beings. They would have been disposed of, but now they're not disposed of, and we're recognizing the value and importance, not just of their unique ways of being, their personalities, their subjecthood, but also how important they are to their communities. And some of those communities in the formerly farmed sanctuary world are mixed communities, and some of them are just a community of, let's say, younger and older chimpanzees. It also, these sanctuary spaces, reframes our understanding of our relationships with other animals. It helps us to see how we've been in these relationships of both actual and historical power and control. And when we're able to rethink those relationships, it can help us to sort of reframe, if you will, what it means to be thinking of others as disposable. And I also think, and this is something that I've been working on with my work on empathy, that for those of us who are involved in animal protection work, animal liberation work, animal rights work, we need to take the empathy and the care and the concern that we have, many of us already do, certainly in sanctuaries, and bring that out into those categories of human who are also thought to be disposable. So I've just put up a list of questions. I'd love to hear more. It's some of the work that I've been thinking of about how do we actually try to develop and operationalize our thinking about how do we empathize beyond and across differences. And so these are just some of these questions. But I do think that ultimately that we are all situated in different ways, and part of what I'm hoping we can talk about, among many things, is how we, the last question here, how are we able to help each other culturally and based on our past histories, to become more successful in our empathetic engagement so that we're able to make a difference. I don't have the answer. I hope that you can help me in answering that question, and I'm open to all sorts of discussion, so thank you. Sure, I'll feed him. I'm not going to feed him. I'll field him.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I work for an organisation called the Donkey Sanctuary, and I've been doing a lot of work in brick kilns where I've observed a whole spectrum of disposability of these animals. So in some brick kilns, a donkey might be like part of the extended family, and in another brick kiln, a donkey may be bought for a season and bought knowing it would be disposed of at the end of that working season. Do you know of any metrics available to help measure this?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm not going to feed him. I'll field him. Sure. I'll feed him. I'll field him.
Hello. Hi. I work for an organisation called the Donkey Sanctuary, and I've been doing a lot of work in brick kilns where I've observed a whole spectrum of disposability of these animals. So in some brick kilns, a donkey may be bought for a season and bought knowing it would be disposed of at the end of that working season. Do you know of any metrics available to help measure
So I'm not 100% sure I heard the full question.
So the question is, do we have any metrics that help us measure across a spectrum of disposability?
So part of the reason that I'm interested in thinking through the category of disposability is I don't think we actually have metrics, because I don't think we've actually theorized what it means, and that's part of what my project is trying to engage, is what is disposability, and when is it only the killing of another that makes that being disposable? I'm arguing no. So we're not going to be able to get the metric if it means that we're just paying attention to how often, let's say, zoos in Waza are euthanizing animals. That would be an example of how many animals are euthanized in the Waza zoos, but it's not helping us to understand whether or not that euthanasia is also consistent with disposability. And I don't want to deny that there are certain instances in which it may be, under certain contexts, may be justified in euthanizing in a way that is fully respectful of the dignity of the animal, and therefore not an instance of disposability. But because we're not thinking or questioning or talking about disposability, I don't think we yet know what metrics we would be looking for. Do you have ideas about that?
I have tried a few things in practice, but I don't have very much support around it. There's a lot of resistance to within the organization.
I see.
Just a follow-up on sort of going back to your example of Marius the giraffe, and it sort of struck me that the examples at the beginning of Harambe and Marius and Cecil, all of those animals are sort of individualized for us because they have names for us. And thinking about disposability of Marius, those lions, I'm assuming in a zoo, which granted they should not be in a zoo in the first place, or any of these animals should be in a zoo, but those lions had been fed, I'm sure, on beef or some other kind of animal carcasses prior to this, so it just strikes me as sort of odd, the public outcry about, this one particular case of killing an animal to feed to these lions when they have been fed other disposable beings or other disposable carcasses. And I'm just wondering if it's because Marius had a name and he was sort of individualized for us, that's what creates that outcry, whereas all of these other animals are disposable without names and without us giving a thought to, their disposability.
Yeah, that's a really excellent thought. I think, right, these examples are sort of high-profile examples of disposability. And I struggle. I mean, I really do struggle with, talking about, I've interacted with, a small percentage of men who are incarcerated. There are millions of men and women and children and transgendered people who are incarcerated. And yeah, so there's these individuals that we use to highlight a certain kind, and we're using, notice I said use, we're using them to highlight a certain kind of problem when there are actually so many, and in the case of the billions of animals that are used for food, it's like that's very system is a system of disposability. The whole system is a system of disposability, and it gets back to this idea too that this is a system that allows us to not recognize the fundamental dignity or value of these individuals. That's right. Thank you for pointing that out.
I want to briefly mention that we're passing around a sheet that people can sign up to if they want to have further conversation about this topic. And with that, Greta.
So in your ethics of captivity and your presentation, of course, you're building a really nice bridge between speciesism and racism and incarceration in the United States. It reminds us of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, or Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th, which if anybody hasn't...
13.
The 13th hasn't seen it, it's on Netflix. Netflix, and it's about the 13th Amendment in the United States and how basically slavery has moved from the visible slavery on the South and plantations to the enslavement of largely black men, a larger black population than is in the greater U.S. population, to make sweatshop clothing and other things. For example, as I love to tell my students, Victoria's Secret. So imagine your lingerie being made by prisoners. It makes it less delectable, yeah. So the question is the nature of the analogy. The animals that are incarcerated in zoos are not guilty. But because of trial by jury, we have to assume that some of the people incarcerated are guilty.
Most.
How do you work that out? Because I think your listeners will have more sympathy for one group than the other. Can you address that?
What I'm trying to focus on in bringing in this particular aspect of the problem of mass incarceration is that there is a variety of, and I didn't do it fully in the presentation, but there's a variety of different ways of thinking about what it is that those who are incarcerated, what their lives are like. They were reading Kant. They were arguing about whether or not if you're on a lifeboat and you had to save an orangutan or a child, whether as a Kantian you would save the child or the orangutan, given that Kant, at least in Kant's ethical theory, didn't really think much of the child or the orangutan. So then there was a whole discussion. We've had discussions about theories of justice, and we've talked about an ethics of care, and they're teaching each other, and young folks who are in prison are being schooled by some of the older people who are in prison. So they are in prison often as a result of a criminal justice system that is full of flaws in a larger economic, political, and racialized system that is deeply flawed. But did they commit some crime? Yes, that's one of the things they did. Did they have children? Are they fathers? Yes. Are they students? Are they teachers? Yes. Are they husbands? Yes. Are they brothers and uncles? Yes. So there's one feature of them. They might have committed a crime, but there's also many other features of them. And when we think of people as disposable, we end up reducing them to one feature that helps us in our justification of their disposability.
Laurie, I do want to add to that there are some categories of animals that we specifically breed in order to be disposable.
Well, right.
And, you know, I well remember a zillion years ago when I was a young woman being trained in biology, getting upset when an animal died, being told, oh, there's more where that came from. That's what we breed them for.
That's right.
So and lab animals are the particular example, but I'm sure there are other categories. There are some that we actually breed in order to be disposable. I mean, I guess agricultural animals too.
Well, agricultural animals, for sure. That's what they're bred to be consumed. And so it's certainly disposable. But thank you for bringing that up, Linda. I rescued, may he rest in peace, I rescued this rat who was supposed to be a little mouse a friend of mine found in a snowbank. It turns out he was a baby rat. You know, and rats and mice in laboratories are absolutely disposable. People couldn't even understand why I would have any sort of attention to them. And I think that that's right. And what I want to highlight, though, is that it's not just that they are disposable institutionally, although they are that, but there's a way in which we pride ourselves. Now, we is a pretty broad category, but there's a certain sense in which, look at us, look how clever we are. We made pens that when they run out, we throw them away. It's a good thing that they're disposable. I mean, thankfully, we're thinking in terms of sustainability, maybe questioning that, but I still think that that's sort of the interaction, part of the relationship we have with humans that sees them as disposable, I think highlights a feature of our relationships that's flawed and needs more attention, beyond the sort of suffering and just instrumentalization. It's instrumentalization of a particular sort that I wanted to highlight. And I wonder, I mean, I think there's a lot of work that we could do there about what happens with turning, what sort of the idea, this is what the sanctuary idea is. So are we, in some ways, creating a transitional pathway from the disposable to the non-disposable, the valuable, and what lessons are we learning in that interstices? What are we learning when we make a disposable being non-disposable? And I think that's part of the work that I've been trying to do in thinking about some of the incarcerated people that I'm working on. Let's move from thinking about them as disposable to non-disposable.
I'm wondering if you've been able to involve any of your students in some of this community work that you're doing, and if you might comment on that, if that's the case. Community work in prisons or in jails, or
which
just
students?
Examples. Yeah.
Which students?
Your students at Wesleyan?
Oh, at Wesleyan. So my students in prison, we think of as Wesleyan students too, because they're getting Wesleyan credits. It's a program we started. Anyway, the campus students, some of them I've worked with as TAs, and there are others that have also worked as TAs. Since we're on this, I just have to tell you this. Really, I told some of you this last night, I think. I was really nervous to tell my incarcerated students about the animal work that I've been doing for 30 years, in part because of my nervousness around the dangerous crossings that Claire Kim and others have talked about. And so I kept it quiet for many years. And it's also true that many of the communities that the men came from have a very different and problematic relationship with other animals. So I was aware a little bit about that as well. It turns out that, surprise, surprise, they already knew that I did this work, and many of them were really interested in doing it more. A couple have written and have been working on becoming vegans in prison, and there's a lot of I think exciting sort of cross-fertilization there that's been really interesting. It's been certainly rewarding for me personally.
Thank you very much. So I just have a quick question, because you're considered about like, well, we haven't really fully theorized disposability. Do you think there's some use, and what you think might be the pitfalls of thinking that maybe at least some of Kant's work tracks this when he talks about things, animals, and even human animals having a relative value, but only persons having absolute worth? And so do you think that could be useful, and what do you think are its pitfalls? Because obviously there are, of course, pitfalls in Kant, but do you think that can be helpful at all?
So that's a really great question. Thank you for asking that question. I don't. And part of the reason I don't is that I think that the framework of personhood requires that we always exclude some others. And this goes back to something that I think we were talking about in the reinvigoration of the dignity, the kernel of dignity that resides in human beings. I mean, a lot of that comes out of the Kantian framework. And so it's not just an accident. I don't think, I would make an argument, but I don't think it's just an accident of history or culture that there was exclusion built into that system. And I think that trying to include always is going to continue to maintain a dualism or a binary, a value dualism, so that some beings will fall outside of it in order to maintain the centrality of those that are included. And I want to think about the mechanisms that allow for those exclusions and start sort of fundamentally poking holes, as it were, perforating those boundaries. So I'm thinking of this visually, if you can imagine. So we have these spheres of moral concern, and we try to extend outward, outward, outward. But there's always someone on the outside. And maybe that mechanism needs to change. And part of the way to do that is to think differently about what it is that are the mechanisms for exclusion rather than the properties or capacities or suites of capacities that allow for inclusion or exclusion. Part of what we understand now about certain anti-Black racism in the United States is that we aren't thinking in terms of properties or not properties because we make new excuses. Or if you think about what happens in context of genocides in, let's say, Rwanda, which I have a marvelous colleague who's been teaching me a lot, who's a survivor of the genocide, who's been teaching me a lot. It's not just about whether you're included or excluded based on certain characteristics that you share, because there's some fundamental functional role that forces of exclusion, like disposability, are playing in maintaining a certain power at the center. And that's what I'm trying to get at.
So we have time for a couple more questions. I'm going to go here and, well, 3 more quick questions. Here, here, and here, with apologies to other people who might have wanted to speak.
Laurie, the idea of disposability obviously brings in concepts of waste as well. I mean, one of the massive issues that we have. Ken Worthy speaks about our dissociative, our disconnect between our actions and the consequences of those actions. So
I'm not really able to hear you. So
oh, sorry, I'm
there
talking
we go.
about.
That's better.
Okay,
that's better.
so disposability, waste. Ken Worthy talks about our dissociative ability to disconnect from our actions and the consequences of our actions. And so it's easy to dispose of something or someone if you don't see the consequences of those actions. You don't have to live with the consequences of those actions. And yeah, you know, if we saw more of what happened behind cages, or you know, the cutting up of an animal, or what happens to Cecil, and some of us did see that, and hence the outrage, because we were the dissociative aspect of it was taken away, I suppose.
Yeah. No, I think your work and Joe MacArthur's work is really, really important in helping us to see what those consequences are. They're framed still largely, in my experience, in terms of suffering. I'm not suggesting that suffering isn't important. It's very important. But what I'm hoping to indicate is that there's another sort of register for categorizing or thinking about what's operating. I mean, one way of doing that, I imagine, is to show, you know, it's very vivid, and I think you see this a little bit in the book Animal Capital, but this way in which disposability became this terrific highlight of the way we manufactured all sorts of goods, that mass production of cheap goods through, you know, these kind of assembly line processes largely influenced the way that we, or they, kill and use create animals for food. So these comparisons can help us see that the way that disposability sort of crosses from one industry to another, but I think that's right. Sorry, I talked too long.
Thank you. Laurie, in your paper in Ethics of Captivity, you give an account of dignity in terms of, you say to treat someone with dignity is to treat them in ways that support social perceptions of them as worthy of respect and compassion, something like that, right? Mm. I think the concept of dignity is really important because it distinguishes whatever you say that has dignity from something that has instrumental value, something that is disposable. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure you know that there is a lot of skepticism nowadays about the concept of dignity. Mm-hmm. Many people are arguing that we should get rid of this concept, that it's empty, it's vague, it's subjective, whatever. Right. So this is a nice conception of dignity as relational, but I want you to say more about how you conceive dignity. If if we can have a more substantial, let's say, account of dignity so that we can respond to this skepticism.
Right. So I think that the idea of dignity it is one of these traditionally vague notions, and I think, as Will rightly said yesterday, there's a sense in which the notion that animals might have dignity is a little bit peculiar. People think, what? That doesn't make sense. I think that animals have a certain kind of wild dignity. Martha Nussbaum thinks that they have a certain kind of species dignity. Martha's view is that their dignity is inherent in them. So this notion that there's a kernel of value and dignity that's expressed through your quote-unquote species-typical behaviors and attitudes or what have you, that's true of humans and that's true of non-humans. I don't agree with that. I think of it as this relational notion that we can see, what we're doing is trying to see that there is a way in which other animals we can, through our actions and actually the consequences of our actions, we can be making a statement about their lack of dignity, their lack of value, just as we can through our actions and our practices in our relations, value them. And part of what I was trying to highlight here is this notion of thinking of and treating other animals as disposable and thinking of and treating other humans as disposable is a way of relationally denying their dignity. I think that's part of the way I would go. Now, if there's another way of, I'm not wedded to this notion of dignity. It just has a certain kind of humph to it. It's like, oh, it's dignity, right? What I'd really like to see is us to reframe how it is that lives lose their value or never gain any value. And I think part of it gets back to this question of it's necessary for those at the center to maintain their value, they think, by denying the other's value. And I want to suggest that's not right, that we can actually think about, we don't have to have this boundary, that there can be a relational play between these various things. But it would really require, as Frank Wilderson III would say, ending the world and starting over.
Okay, final quick question, and then we can all go eat lunch.
Hi, my question has to do with political prisoners, like from the Animal Liberation Front. The case of Walter Bond, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but what is your opinion about the treatment that they receive when they are political prisoners? They are isolated from the rest of the prisoners. And he has been like that for many, many months. And he was even denied a vegan food because of the reason of his crimes.
I'm hearing bits and pieces. Speak up right into the mic, because it was going in and out.
Okay, it's about political prisoners from, for example, the Animal Liberation Front.
Right.
I don't know if you're familiar with the case of Walter Bond, but he was recently denied vegan food, and he has been isolated for many months. And these prisoners, particularly, they are the system is particularly cruel to them. So I would like to know your opinion about it, and if you have written about this topic or.
Yeah, okay, yeah, right. So some of the prison work that I started doing, some of my prison education work was with, actually, Lauren Gozala, who has a chapter in my book. Some of the men I teach also do, but Lauren was one of the first political prisoners in the United States for doing work that involved animal liberation. So she was one of the people under the early Animal Liberation, Animal Terrorism, and Enterprise Terrorism Act convictions. And I do think that it is, I would, and so yes, there are people who are incarcerated who are political prisoners for a variety of reasons. I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, obviously, there are all sorts of people who are incarcerated who are having all sorts of dignity-denying affronts, cruelties, all sorts of suffering, and are being treated really as disposable. It is important, I think, in the case of those of us who are committed to animal liberation, to also really highlighting what's happening in prisons with our colleagues who are there under animal liberation charges, and not to focus only on the individuals who are there because of the particular things that they did to land them there, unfortunately, but to also perhaps open up the other fronts that are going on, the other cruelties that are going on to those people who are incarcerated as well.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Lori.
Thank you.